very warm welcome. My name's David Roth and I'm the CEO of the store WPP and Chairman of BAV. And it's an absolute pleasure to welcome you to Follow the Sun, 24 hours of broadcasting right across the world, to celebrate the launch of the WPP BAV Best Countries study for 2022, produced in conjunction with the US News and Wharton Business School. It's a pleasure to have you join us for this session. This broadcast is going to travel right across the world, starting in New Zealand and ending 24 hours later in the USA. We have an absolutely packed broadcast today. This year's Best Countries study is our fullest and most comprehensive yet. The attitudes of global business leaders, opinion formers and citizens towards nation strengths has changed dramatically in recent years, never more so than in 2022. And we'll be looking at how those changes in values have impacted overall perceptions of our 85 nations covered in the 2022 study. But perceptions of a country only tell half the story. We'll then visit 24 countries to hear what's happening from WPP experts on the ground and sometimes how perceptions of a country don't really reflect the situation. Now, our time together promises to be informative, challenging, stimulating, and I hope fun. So let's get started. How a country is viewed around the world is of huge importance, politically, economically, and socially. It has the ability to contribute to both a nation's hard and soft power. The Romans understood this well. SPQR, an abbreviation for Centanus Populosque Romanus, was arguably the first country branding. It was an emblematic, abbreviated phrase referring to the government of the ancient Roman Republic. You only needed to see the emblem, and invaded countries knew exactly what was in store for them. So country branding itself is not new, but measuring it is. Now in our 7th year, the WPP BAV Annual Best Countries Rankings measures global perceptions of countries against a series of characteristics, impressions that have the potential to drive trade, travel and investment. They also directly affect brands. The study was developed by WPP BAV, the Wharton Business School of the University of Pennsylvania, and US News. The ranking is based on a large global survey which asks a range of people about how they perceive different countries against a range of key attributes. Country branding also has a significant impact on corporate and product brands. The words "made in" can instantly lend credibility and trust to a product or brand that a consumer hasn't previously encountered. That could be enough to convince someone to buy and beyond that, convince them to pay a premium. Likewise, "made in" can prove an instant turn-off if a consumer associates the country of origin with poor safety standards or sees it as being behind the times on social issues or workers' rights. But it's not just a one-way reaction. The perceptions and performance of brands abroad feedback into the development of the country itself. Additionally, willingness for corporates to invest vital FDI is also closely linked to the strength of a country's brand. As local brands and businesses succeed, they generate economic growth as well as lending further positive associations to their country's brand. There's a close relationship between how people feel about a country and their attitudes towards the brand they associate with that country. Strong countries fuel strong brands and vice versa. Think of France and Chanel. Both represent elegance, glamour and prestige. Chanel is intrinsically French and France is synonymous with Chanel. The same can be said of Italy and Ferrari, or Japan and Sony. In each case, brands and the countries are part of a virtuous circle, a symbiotic relationship. In fact, Germany is a really fine example of this symbiosis in action. Germany has come to represent the qualities of durability and engineering that brands like Bosch, BMW, Audi, and Mercedes have shown the world that Germany can deliver. Brands can both shape and be shaped by the perceptions of their country of origins. Japan in the 1970s was known as a cheap manufacturing base, but now respected as a world leader for quality electronics and also technology, thanks largely to brands like Sony and Toyota. South Korea has taken a similar path, with Samsung and Hyundai demonstrating to the entire world what modern South Korea is and is doing, so creating consumer predisposition in international markets that favour other South Korean brands. There's a two-way reaction and a multiplier effect for both. This year's study quantifies the impact. We see that 83% of consumers globally agree that consumer brands play an important role in defining a country's culture. 78% also agree that the country a product is made in impacts my preference to purchase it. Our annual Best Countries ranking was first launched in 2016 at the World Economic Forum meeting in Davos, the world's largest gathering of global leaders and heads of industry and influence. It's now in its 7th year, and given how turbulent the past 7 years have been across the globe, enables us to see the impact of the changes. The Best Country ranking incorporates the views of close to 18,000 individual members of the public and business decision makers, surveyed in 85 countries across the world. This year's survey was completed in mid-2022. Collectively, the 85 countries in the 2022 rankings account for about 95% of global gross domestic product per capita and represent 80% of the world's population. Individuals surveyed for Best Countries were asked how closely they associated 73 attributes with a range of countries. These attributes were then grouped into 10 categories that were used to calculate the Best Countries ranking, and more on those attributes later. So come with me as we meet our first guests on our interview stage. Well, I'm very delighted now to be joined by Lord Jim O'Neill, the former Chief Economist of Goldman Sachs and a former government UK Minister and Chairman of Chatham House. Jim, Lord O'Neill, thank you very much indeed for joining us.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me on.
President Zelensky has said that the price we have to pay for avoiding a third world war is going to be higher energy bills, increases in the cost of living, and a reduction in living standards. And this comes at a time where we see from our BAV Best Countries study that softer values, sort of like quality of life and social purpose, are much more important in defining a nation's brand. But do you think that public opinion at the moment will pressurise governments to hold their current policies, or do you think they will start to look at alternatives?
Nice, easy question that you start with. I don't know, because it is probably for my generation, never mind the younger generation, the first such issue of this scale and complexity that we've seen. So far, it appears Western nations, who are the prime supporters of Ukraine, of course, have been happy to support the government stance on Ukraine, and superficially accept the cost, which is essentially this enormous cost of living shock. But it remains to be seen how that passes the test of time. So as we're seeing here, the government itself is almost definitely going to have to pay for the cost of this dilemma. I can't help finishing my answer to this very tricky question by also pointing out that if we really want to be serious about climate change and alternative energies, having a permanently higher price for carbon emitting energy forms is probably ultimately the sort of thing that is needed. One would imagine accelerate the desire for alternative energies to become more and more part of everyday life.
Now, you were chairman of the Chatham House, one of the world's leading think tanks. Its mission of a world that is sustainable, secure and prosperous is great. What do you feel, how far are we from realising that goal?
Isn't and hasn't really worked the way it's supposed to do on the tin.
So Jim, what should the priorities of nations be then now?
Yeah, so what should we do about it? You know, I've become linked to a number of things I've been involved in, a big believer in what I broadly call profit with purpose. And we need to have business itself think more about the societal remit of who ultimately they serve. We've lived in an era, and still do, of where the only thing that matters for many, certainly publicly quoted business, is the shareholder. And it's not enough. And private business shouldn't be rewarded if we don't have productivity that goes with these big gains for them. And policymakers need to be more alert to the realities of life rather than just what was in economic textbooks of the 1960s and 70s. And if we don't learn from that, I have a fear that some of the dilemmas that have just blown up dramatically in the past few years out of nowhere could actually get worse.
Now, we started with a hard question, so let's end with an easy one. Lord O'Neill, are you an optimist or a pessimist given the situation we see around the world today?
Right now, I feel a lot more pessimistic than I've done for a long time. However, that said, I've been around the policy area in many different forms for over 40 years, and I've lived through a lot of crises. And the one thing I know for sure is that the crisis you're in, even though it often seems the worst you've ever been through, they come to an end. And one of the big things I've learned is never let a crisis go to waste. And indeed, the making of a business, a leader, or of a country is how they respond to the crisis you are in, because it normally defines how you're going to deal with the future era. So in that sense, there are lots of ways of things that could emerge from all of this mess in a more positive way.
Well, Lord Jim O'Neill, ending on a slightly more positive note than we started, thank you very much indeed for joining us. It's been a privilege to hear what you have to say. Thank you very much indeed.
You're welcome. Thanks for having me joining you.
As we travel around the world together in our Follow the Sun broadcast, we'll be hearing news, views and insights from local WPP company colleagues in 24 of the 85 countries covered in the WPP BAV Best Countries study for 2022. Now, before we go to one of those countries, let's remind ourselves of the WPP BAV Best Countries 2022 rankings from the 85th down to the number 1 country. Let's see what the overall findings of Best Countries 2022 are before we go to the WPP team. And don't forget to download the Best Countries Metaverse experience for even more global insights from the address on your screen. Historically, military power and finance, banks and tanks were the attributes against which we measured a country's power in the world. Not anymore. So what does all this mean? It shows that a nation focused on providing great quality of life for its people, which cares about the rights and equality, and has a focus on entrepreneurship, is seen as having the most powerful nation brand. This reflects a world today and the factors that influence public perceptions and consumer decision-making, and by implication, a nation's political policy making. So let's take a look at those 10 factors and their weights for 2022. Entrepreneurship, 14.2%. Cultural influence, 10.4%. Power, 5%. Heritage, 3.1%. Adventure, 5.5%. Quality of life, 14.5%. Open for business, 9.3%. Social purpose, 13.5%. Agility, 14%. Movers, 10.6%. So it's clearly no longer just tanks and banks that give a country influence around the world. Softer power, which comes about as a result of entrepreneurship and cultural exports, is increasingly making an impact.
Fly Scoot. She's the marketing director. She has worked extensively with both global as well as government brands. And what's really interesting about Agatha is she's not only a born and bred Singaporean and perfect for this conversation that we're about to deep dive into, but she also brings with her a lot of experience, both from the client as well as the agency side. She's an extreme representation of everything that Singapore stands for. And I think she was, for us, the perfect guest to have with us on this particular edition of the Little Red Dot Diaries, which unpacks what we have been able to unpack as data for this year's BAV Follow the Sun. A couple of things that we've learned from what the BAV data has shown us is not only is Singapore open for business again, but we have been ranked very high as a digital economy, making us one of the most youngest and innovative economies. Our heritage and culture continues to draw in crowds as well as businesses. And I think it's this culture of progress that we will increasingly focus and talk about. But let's hear from Agatha on what her understanding as a born and bred Singaporean is about what is the Little Red Dot represent for you, Aggie?
Hello, everyone. It's such a pleasure to be here. I hope to be able to share, I suppose, my perceptions of what is it like. I think being born and bred in Singapore, I call us, a little red dot. And we really are a little red dot because at the end of the day, we're really just at the tip of the Malayan Peninsula from a geographic sense. We are a very young nation, just under 60-year-old. We're a tiny population of barely 5.5 million, and therefore little in any physical sense. But I do think that we're little and somewhat mighty and big on impact. And therefore, sort of like, I think that the red is large and impactful. And at the same time, the red is also green. So as shared, we're a tropical island. We are a city-state. I believe we're one of only three city-states in the world, off of the tip of the Malayan Peninsula. And I'll say, from a global stage perspective, we're probably sort of made ourselves known for a couple of things. We have a world-class airline. We have a world-class airport. I think for many, many years, the ports in Singapore has got to be a top 3 port, if not the #1 port in the world. We also pioneered the first night zoo in the world. And recently, just a couple of years ago, just pre-COVID, I believe we've also pioneered the first night race of F1. And at the same time, I believe we've been given the accolade of being one of the greenest cities in the world. I think small but fairly mighty in certain ways. Red but fairly green as well.
That's great. I think everyone who lives in this part of Singapore knows it as the Garden City. And I think more recently, there was also a lot of chatter and talk about being one of the most greenest parts of the world. And what's also interesting when you say we have one of the best airlines and one of the best airports in the world, we are a very well-traveled population. And that takes me to understand a little bit from your perspective, now with the pandemic pretty much behind us, and fingers crossed, hopefully it stays that way. There have been lots of learnings. There have been some very key shifts in the way behavior has changed, in the way industries have changed, in the way people have also started caring and also getting out, flying. What, in your perspective, what are the key shifts that you have seen in a service-led business such as yours? And what do you think has been the long-term impact that they will have on our economy?
I think certainly, one is obviously us just heaving a huge sigh of relief that the skies have reopened again. I think both from a business perspective, with Scoot being the low-cost arm of Singapore Airlines Group. So I think we're hugely happy to be able to transport people again, to be able to enable human connections again globally. And obviously on a personal level as well, I think, coming from such a tiny country of 5.5 million, I am personally happy to be able to take a breather around the world again. But that said, I think the temporary setback, in the past 2.5, coming to 3 years or so, have certainly got us to sort of like rethink some immediate priorities. I think being guest-centric remains key. It's always been, I believe, sort of like front and center of what we do. But that said, it's even more important, tied into that, what was probably, especially in our part of the world, in Asia, being guest-centric and safety can be, to a huge degree, taken for granted. It's hygiene factor, but I think the pandemic's basically sort of like, turned this into a reset where we don't take it for granted. I'll say sort of like guest centricity and safety remains paramount moving forward. And hand in hand with this, staff training and well-being, I think COVID's obviously affected all of us in many ways, and even at the workplace. I think employees' well-being and a reset to the definitions of work, ways to work, commitment to work. And now, COVID's basically shown us that with technology, with connectivity, in actual fact, maybe a reframed definition that we can almost sort of plug in and work from anywhere. I think these things are sort of like key things that probably most corporations need to think about. I think this is something that the nations actually really talked about. I mean, our governments actually talked about it. In fact, of late, there's a huge debate about whether Singapore's ready to adopt a 4-day work week as part of a post-pandemic without obviously having to sacrifice all of the corporate KPIs that is needed for a solid recovery. And I think one other bit that the pandemic sort of like showed us and that has helped accelerate is obviously the whole area of digital and technology, and embracing that, and embracing it for myriad of reasons, embracing it for even more efficiency, embracing it for basically making it even easy for ourselves to run our businesses and for guests to sort of use services. I'll say sort of like by and large, I think those are key takeaways.
I think it's very interesting to hear from an industry point of view the importance of how we would normally say customer centricity, but when it comes from the hospitality and aviation business, how you actually see customers as guests, and guest centricity is fundamental. It's the core of your strategy. And increasingly, we also, as patrons of Scoot and both Singapore Airlines, I think it's interesting to see how it's not just the guests, but it's also the importance given to staff well-being and training, because safety and certain other fundamentals that it really takes to be successful in this business have been, in fact, reinforced when people might, tend to take them for granted, as well as, and you rightly said this, digitization has only accelerated. Digitization has become almost second nature to most of our businesses, especially service-led industries, where convenience and taking away barriers and removing barriers to create more seamlessness, agility, and connectivity is paramount. And what's interesting from what we've learned from this year's data as well is Singapore continues to rise in the ranks of being designed in such a manner. The digital infrastructures make Singapore so attractive to do business as well as to live, work, and play. As much as that sounds a cliche, but it is the digital infrastructure that is making life and doing business interesting and making Singapore so attractive. That takes me to an interesting conversation that we've been having here at VMLY&R and across WPP as well on what is Singaporeanness. And if you learn from some of the attributes that we've been able to, put together to bootstrap, there are, I think, 5 attributes that define Singaporeanness. It is to start with the fact that there is a digital infrastructure in place. We're a very multicultural nation, and I think that's represented across our businesses, that's represented across the social fabric. We are very equitable. I like something that you said. We're a little red dot, but we have a green heart. We are a very sustainable city-state as well. And while there is a rich culture and heritage, which is not Singapore alone, but a bit of Indian, Malay, Chinese, etc., our culture is that of progress always. And I think when you bring some of these attributes together, all the way from digitization to multicultural centricity and sustainability, that really comes for us to define what Singaporeanness means. And what I would really like to ask and get your thoughts on is how do you see this reflected in Singaporeans' homegrown airline like Scoot?
Mm, wow, I really have to think about that a little bit. I think well, I think, first of all, we've almost got to take a step back and sort of understand what is it like to, say, work in Singapore before applying that to the lens of school, let's say. I think first thing is that while I say we're, I think, and I say that with a lot of Singaporean pride, right? I think small but mighty in impact. But that said, I think, I'll be humble enough to also say that we're always reminded that we are small. We're small in many ways. I mean, we almost import everything that we eat. And the local joke is that we even have to import the water that we drink. We buy water off of Malaysia and Indonesia. So we're very limited in resources. And the biggest strengths that we have actually comes from just sort of like, sort of one product, and that's people. So I think the starting point is understanding that therefore the entire environment is such that we grow up in an environment that requires us to basically be adaptive, be open, be accepting. I hope I've basically gotten the latest census, but I'm very certain that somewhere between easily 20% to a quarter of the residents in Singapore are actually foreigners. Yep. Aside from the very fact that the country is already made up of 4 key national races. So, we are as diverse as can be. And therefore, I think back to the Singapore identity, I think, it isn't about a single stereotype, but I think ultimately there is this sense of, I suppose, one national identity of just being Singaporean and being proud that we're constantly able to be agile. We constantly learn and relearn. We're open to, to guests in our countries, whether they be travelers, whether they be, co-workers, and we never rest on our laurels. And I'll say that this adage probably applies even, at Scoot or at Singapore Airlines. And maybe cycling back to an earlier point about being guest-centric, I think sort of back to yet again post-pandemic, it's because I think it's sort of bugging me a little bit, and I didn't want to leave it there, because being guest-centric and an LCC model doesn't quite go hand in hand. But I think that said, yet again, maybe this is an example of the Singapore pride, of if you think of airlines, and what will be parity in airlines will be your full service carriers, and that's where Singapore Airlines sort of like sits in that space. And then, sort of like your value players, and that's where the space that Scoot sits in. If we operate on sort of like those two spaces in the matrix of things, then, SQ on sort of full service carrier would probably just compete with other global sort of, global service carriers of the world on perhaps, best global connectivities and timing and eventually price. And then on the other side, on the other spectrum, you have Scoot. And if we're a value player, we'll probably go as cheap as we can, as little as we can, bring everything down to the bare minimum. I think therein then perhaps that interesting dichotomy in that we're even talking about being guest-centric. either in, translated to making it easy, making it efficient, still not devoid of certain sort of like necessary touches in an LCC form, or taking it to the other extreme, which is what Singapore Airlines has always been known for, which is, that entire narrative of rewriting what is service altogether.
Yeah.
I'm not sure if that's a good analogy of what it is to be sort of like, what it means to sort of succeed in the likes of either, Singapore or Singapore Inc. or in a Singapore global company, such as, Scoot.
Yeah, I think it's interesting. I like how you are linking the one Singapore identity. And I think as residents, as working professionals, as key decision makers such as you in an industry, in a very large business, the Singapore identity, the single identity is a very good representation of Singaporeanness, because it does talk about being very open-minded, never settling. That's also something that I think we see on a day-to-day basis in our interaction with people, with consumers, with clients as well. They're always open to learn because they also come with an open-mindedness, but also with a growth mindset. And I think that is something that Singapore always encourages, Singapore always supports. And one interesting point from what we've learned from our data is that agility now more than ever, given that there is such a drive for digital acceleration and building more digital infrastructures, making life and doing business more convenient, more efficient. I think it's also agility allows you to be a bit more contributive to the economy, which is where Singapore is very proud of hosting those kind of incubators, giving more benefits for people with ideas. And, for anyone who comes into Singapore, both from a talent perspective or also from a career growth perspective, there is lots for them to see in this little red dot and how they can play a small role in making a big impact. I think, Aggie, with that, thank you so much. Thank you so much for being with us on this edition of Follow the Sun. It was lovely having you and also getting your perspective on where we are today as a nation, where we are today as an industry, as a service-led business, a proud service-led business such as Scoot and Singapore Airlines, and what I think Singaporeanness is a definition in the making, but an identity is an important attribute to that. And with that, I'd really like to thank you for your time, and we'll see you around very soon. Thank you so much, Aggie.
All right, pleasure. Cheers.
Well, I'm absolutely thrilled and delighted now to be joined by Dr. Stacey Graham, who is the Global Racial Equity Programs Director at WPP. Stacey, thank you very much indeed for joining us.
Thank you for the invitation.
This year we see social purpose becoming significantly important, which is a good thing. Why do you think that's so?
I believe in the survey you define social purpose around a few categories, such as caring about gender and racial equity, the environment, human rights, and so forth, right? And what we understand about humans is we have an innate desire to have a reason for being. That's another word for purpose. So I'd say if we look at what's happened in the world in the last 2.5, 3 years, that is definitely catapulted into the mainstream. We have all these things coming together that are pinpointing, illustrating how we're failing as a collective.
And do you think that failure as a collective is something that's now being exposed right across the globe?
Absolutely. I would say that even before 2020, we could see it happening, but there's something about a restriction of freedom of movement, right, that makes people sit at home and have nothing else to do but recognize and look into everything that's wrong with the world, if you will. And so I think that it's on people's minds. What does it mean to be in the collective when I'm sitting at home and can't leave my house anymore? What does it mean to really be connected as a society? How do we care for the most vulnerable? And to be really honest, with COVID-19, we didn't do a great job of that. So I think people are asking different questions than they were 2 to 3 years ago.
And I think I found it quite interesting to see the relationship between this movement, I mean, let's call it a movement, coming from the population upwards.
Absolutely. I mean, we also see that some of our health officials do move more politically than we would have expected. But there were people across the world who made the decision to wear a mask even when it was no longer mandated, who stayed at home even when they didn't want to, who got on the streets for probably the largest social movement since 1968, right? It was a global social movement to bring awareness to racial inequality. So I think there's a coming together even in times of divisiveness.
Now, one of the things we've seen in the study is this sort of interrelationship between a country's brand and companies' brands, and we're seeing that interrelationship even more sort of mingled and prevalent this year. So what should companies do to improve their social purpose in relation to how their country is seen?
That is a great question. I think that is something that they're still figuring out. But one thing we know for sure is people aren't simply incentivized by money. That's not enough to keep employees today. Employees want to work somewhere where they feel proud of not only the work that they do, but the things that the company stands for. They want to see their company standing up for social issues that they personally care about.
Stacey, why do you think suddenly companies are finding a political voice as opposed to purely a corporate voice?
I think to an extent, we have been able to observe this shift away. When I studied, there was a clear connection. The business strategy has to align with shareholder value. That's all we care about, maximizing shareholder value. And there was a notion that maximizing shareholder value stood in opposition to a social purpose, if you will. And today, I think people are recognizing that's actually not true. And we increase shareholder value when we can ensure that we have high employee engagement, low turnover, and people care about what they do in the company they work for.
Well, Stacey Graham, that's a fantastic place to stop. This whole topic is something that we are all going to have to understand a lot better, and not just understand it, but also ensure that it's actions as opposed to merely words. But for the moment, Dr. Stacey Graham, the Global Racial Equity Programs Director at WPP, thank you very much indeed for joining me.
Thank you.
Hello and a very warm welcome. My name's David Roth and I'm the CEO of the store WPP and Chairman of BAV. Thank you very much indeed for joining me in this very special metaverse experience. exploring the WPP BAV Best Countries 2022 study in conjunction with Wharton Business School and US News. Here we are in the Arrivals Hall, where you'll be able to discover the key insights from this year's study relating to global trends. Here you'll also find exclusive interviews with global experts and analysis of the data. And what a year we've had. There have been a lot of changes from last year. From here you can also go and visit the 85 countries that are ranked in this year's report. Each of those countries have their own individual room where you can explore a wealth of data and insights into each individual country. You might well see some surprises along your journey. And in the departure area, you can discover more about the study itself. Enjoy your trip around the BAV Best Countries 2022 Metaverse. Well, we're almost at the end of our broadcast. A big thanks to everybody from the local WPP companies who've participated, and of course our central team that's put together all of our Follow the Sun 24 hours of broadcasting, to our directors, to Indus Gupta, to Paul Reifer, and our producers, Sarah Cousins and Lady Victoria Robinson. Well, all it's left for me, David Roth at WPP, to say thank you very much indeed for joining, and the next broadcast follows shortly on the hour.
From the start.